So my name is Dave, and I've been leading this walk for about 21 years. I want to record myself because I won't always be around. And I want this walk to go on for another 70 years or so, maybe on YouTube or whatever the new technology is at that time. This walk is about social movements, which the simplest definition of a social movement is a large number of people working together to resist or fix a challenge of the day. And an example of that would be here in San Francisco today. There's many challenges, but the most obvious one really for the population is how to afford to live here. A one-bedroom apartment averages over $3,000 a month, so with an average income of about $57,000, that's out of bounds for about 70% of the population as it turns out here. We'll be looking at social movements from the economic point of view, and I'm going to divide the social movements we look at into 4 categories chiefly. One will be in how to respond to the problem of the wealth divide, is the specific challenge we're looking at, into acts of charity, to idealistic attempts by a small community to not try to change society but to live within its own experience in a satisfactory way, and then more socialistic, I guess you could say, traditional attempts by groups of people to change society at large. And so again, I use the word socialistic, more social in nature and scope. And then this San Francisco idea, which I'm going to call geoeconomics, and we'll get to that in the last third of the walking tour and see how it's originated and how it's actually been embraced to one degree or another around the world. One of the suggestions that came to me was there's not enough social movements that I talk about, specific social movements on the tour. So I'm going to talk about 5 right now very briefly, and then you can say, yes, I heard about a good many social movements that had to do with San Francisco. And in no particular order. The Mormons, you may not think of the Church of Latter-day Saints as being a social movement, but by the definition of facing a challenge of the day, which was how to be accepted into their community, the Mormons were considered an outcast group. It originated, I'm not going to give you the full story, but it was originated by a fellow named Joseph Smith in New York State back in 1822, who claimed to have talked with angels. They believed that if a male leads 4 good, they believe in reincarnation, if you lead 4 good lives in a row, you will get your own planet. They believe that Jesus was just another guy who led 4 good lives in a row, got his planet Earth. The Mormon Church has been steadily growing in membership church, and why is it? My belief is early on, it's because it offered people another planet, not just heaven, but instead they would get a physical earth and they'd get to be the emperor of it in a sense. They were considered by other Christians as this apostate group that should be actually condemned and exterminated. So they had to leave New York, then move into Illinois, and so the Mormons eventually went to Salt Lake City, but that wasn't their original destination. It was San Francisco, as a matter of fact. In 1846, the population of San Francisco nearly doubled with the arrival of a ship from New York City bringing 300 Mormons. And this was to be the outpost, and the Mormons were going to move here. Well, the wagon wheels fell off of their wagons about Salt Lake City, and that's how that came to be. At that time, California was not part of the United States. It was part of Mexico, and so it was still an open territory for that purpose. But the largest temple outside of Salt Lake City is in Oakland, which is across the water. Again, in no particular order, the anti-war movement. These are some photographs from the 1960s, war protests here in San Francisco, resisting the Vietnam War. Here's the 2003, the invasion of Iraq. The signature American social movement would have to be the American Indians experience. Here are these folk who weren't, we shouldn't have a romantic notion that the Indians were living a perfect life and in harmony with absolutely everything. Not so. Nevertheless, the place that they occupied was taken away, and they were described as being savages and less than human beings by those who conveniently then went about systematically and not so systematically exterminating them, genocide. Here in San Francisco in 1969, 200 members of AIM, the American Indian movement, banded together and occupied Alcatraz Island for 2 years, nearly 2 years, symbolically, to challenge this idea of whose land is it. Speaking of Occupy, here are some photographs from the Occupy movement. You may know that in about 2008 there was a recession that began, the collapse in the banking industry, financial world had a struggle. By 2010 there were massive numbers of people who had purchased homes on mortgage over time, and they couldn't afford. By design, they were not able to pay those mortgages, and so they were being evicted by the banks. These were what were called predatory loans. In order to keep the price of real estate high, banks were issuing loans to people they knew could not afford to make the payments, but they wanted to keep the price of real estate high, and the way to do that was to give people money or at least an obligation to repay a loan that they couldn't manage. And the result was, predictably, at last the financial program just broke down. The Occupy movement was a movement, a gathering of people who wanted to resist the financial sector. And they set up tents in front of banks, first in New York City, but there were, you could call them chapters, I suppose, solidarity groups throughout the country. Here in San Francisco, there were 2 separate chapters from the larger Occupy movement. That is, they were specific to neighborhoods. I happen to have lived in one of those neighborhoods, Bernal Heights. And Bernal Heights had its own Occupy group, and that group was, as a geographic area, the most successful in resisting the eviction of those who were subject to these predatory loans. Don't think that San Francisco's always been that bastion of a safe place. I would say that historically, cities that are on the water tend to be, the ocean, because there's such a mix of different peoples, tend to be places where communities that would otherwise stand out can hide. And so San Francisco and New York, and again other coastal cities, almost certainly the same in Europe, have been places where marginalized communities can get along better than being in the interior of the country where they would be more apparent. And so, yes, there's always been a comparatively large LGBTQ community in San Francisco, but it was also persecuted by the city. You don't have a notion that this was, again, always a blessed place for that community. So beaten up on the steps of City Hall here in 1961. On the other hand, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay politician in the United States, was elected to be a member of the board of supervisors, and then George Moscone, who was the mayor of San Francisco. Both of these men were assassinated in 1979, and that tremendously launched even further the greater militarization, that is resistance politically by the LGBT community here in the United States. 2003, San Francisco was the first place where gay marriage was legalized in the state of California. Oh, why the cat? What's the cat? This image originated here in San Francisco in the 1880s, and for a small number of people, the expression "to see the cat" means you've seen this experience, this idea, this way of looking at the world, which I'm going to be introducing you to. And once you see it, you can't not see it. Now, you may not agree with it, but you'll say, I see what he was talking about, at least. That's my ambition of this walk, is to startle you a bit in that direction. What he did was begin serving the material needs of this neighborhood. So he developed the very first addiction programs for alcohol and drug abuse in the city. He also initiated a program of feeding the hungry. The church serves 750,000 meals a year.